Mark chapter 5, verses 21 through 43. Listen for the word of the living God as we read these words. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her that she may be made well, that she may live." So Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see all the crowd pressing all about you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from Jairus' house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only trust." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha," which means little girl, "Cum," get up. And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was 12 years of age. At this, they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The living God still speaks today. Thanks be to God. We often look to political and social structures around us to source our expectations regarding God. How we relate to God often is how we relate to those in our midst that we deem powerful, important. We confuse our political and social systems as representing God after the manner of God's dealings with humanity, as carrying out God's will and intention. That same confusion is inherent in Christian nationalism. Jesus eschewed political power. He didn't embrace it. It was one of the temptations he refused. When Jesus was before Pilate, he said, "My reign is not of this world." It's not in conflict, in confrontation with Rome and Rome's power. He refused to be the expected military and political Messiah that the Jews so desperately wanted. Why would we consider God unapproachable, like so many who would deem themselves too important to be bothered with the likes of us? Jesus was a busy man by anyone's definition. He couldn't seem to get any time alone. He was on one side of the lake, hounded by crowds. He got into a boat and went to the opposite side of the lake, and a crowd followed him and surrounded him again. Jesus had difficulty getting from one place to the next because of these crowds. Earlier in Mark, we read how the crowds were surrounding the house where Jesus was, and it was almost impossible for anyone to enter. That was the story with the paralytic. That was the story when Jesus' mother and sisters and brothers came. That's the same story again today. In the midst of Jesus' popularity, he had difficulty moving about because everyone wanted to see him, as though the circus had come to town and this was their one chance for mass free entertainment. People would surround him like paparazzi and fans going crazy over a Hollywood star. But there was no police barricade. There was no cordon by the Secret Service to keep people at bay. And it was in just such a moment of his travels that we find Jesus in today's passage of Mark. The disciples walked closest to Jesus, being the closest thing he had to some security cordon, but that was not necessarily their intent or purpose. While they were close to Jesus, people in the crowd were still right in their midst. One of these was a woman who purposefully touched Jesus' clothing. Silently, she was seeking relief and healing from a distressing condition that kept her from being part of society. See, legally, she should have been walking around like the lepers, saying, "Unclean, unclean, unclean," warning people that if they contacted her, they would become ritually impure. They would be denied participation in the synagogue or in the temple. They would need to go and cleanse themselves. She didn't want to be in the public limelight. If the crowd knew her condition, she would have been greeted with sticks and stones and sent scurrying away the way they did with lepers. But in her desperation, she took a gamble. She risked being found out as she approached Jesus through the crowd, doubtless pushing her way through. From a legal standpoint, she made a large part of that crowd ritually impure, unclean, unacceptable. Remember hearing years back of soldiers reportedly dipping bullets in pig's blood while they were serving in the Middle East to so contaminate the people that they were fighting? The same sense of contamination that those Muslims in the Middle East today might perceive of any contact with pig's blood is the same kind of reaction they would have had to touching this woman or her touching them. Well, there was plenty of reason for her to be timid in her approach to Jesus. If she were found out, it could mean her life. If she approached Jesus directly and asked for his healing, she was likely to incur the wrath of these crowds who surrounded him, who impeded her way. She didn't want to bother Jesus. She also didn't want to be found out. So she took what she understood to be the stealth approach. Her actions took boldness, courage, and a brazen hope that touching Jesus' clothing would somehow counter any ritual impurity in her. The same ritual impurity that was understood to infect anyone she touched. That somehow Jesus and his clothing even would overcome the power of her illness to contaminate. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to bother Jesus. She didn't want to allow her secret to be made known. But Jesus stopped the whole procession of the crowd upon her touch. He was not bothered by her. He did not chastise her for making him ritually unclean, which is rather much what we should have expected. Rather, he was concerned to reassure her that she was indeed healed and could move about in freedom. He was bothered by her fear, her trepidation, not for her impeding his progress. Jesus had already been interrupted, hadn't he? Jairus, a ruler, a leader of the synagogue, had come before him and begged that he would stop his journey, stop wherever he was going, and take a detour to his home to care for his little girl he understood was dying. Why would Jesus be bothered to be waylaid for a girl? In a patriarchal society that normally did not even reference daughters when they spoke of family, a family history of generations. Her social value did not seem to make the slightest difference. And yet Jesus turns in compassion for her and for Jairus. Jairus sought him out. Jesus went. The woman with the issue of blood interrupted Jesus. Interestingly, she is the only one in the crowd who is mentioned by Mark. She was unclean, unworthy. Jairus' daughter was insignificant in the eyes of this same crowd, this same society. These, however, are the main characters in Mark's narrative here. Jesus grants his personal attention to both of them. They were not a bother to Jesus. They were not simply obstructions on his way. They were not people to be avoided. They were not unworthy of Jesus' care, of Jesus' attention. We should not have expected Jesus to stop his progress to speak to this woman with the issue of blood. He did not really have to. She had already been healed, hadn't she? Without his direct attention, she was already taken care of. It would seem there would be no reason for him to stop, to call attention to her. And yet, amid the press of the crowds, Jesus notices her and calls her forward, calls her out. He made sure that she knew that whatever anyone else had to say about her, she was not a bother to him. She was not an interruption. She was worthy of his touch, his concern. And there was no need for her to hide herself from him. All around me, growing up in Brazil, people were concerned about having access to God. The prevailing notion among Roman Catholics is that you could pray to God all you wanted, but you're never going to get through. Think of all the people clamoring for God's attention, and God is just too busy to listen to the likes of us. So instead, they say, we will pray to the saints. They're not quite so busy. We'll pray to Mary. I mean, after all, she's Jesus' mother, and if she tells him to do something, then, her son's got to listen. So he can play the trump card with her. This saint over here is concerned with lost things, so he will hear my prayer if I am concerned with something I have lost. This saint is the saint of travelers, and if I am traveling and on my way, let me go to him because he has this attachment to the issue I am struggling with. Within Afro-Brazilian Spiritism, we found pretty much the same. There was a notion of this great and high and powerful God, but no one had access to Exu. Now, you could gain access to some of the lesser deities, the Orishas. But your best bet was probably to try to speak to a lesser spirit, the spirit of some departed person and ancestor, and gain their intervention because God is just way too far removed, too busy to bother with the likes of us. At annual conference last week, I was walking down the hillside towards Stewart Auditorium. Now, at that time, we had told one another that if Karen was ever going to leave the Airbnb, Kurt was going to have to bring the helicopter over to airlift her out. Once getting up that hill, she wasn't too sure about ever coming back down. This car pulled up next to me and offered me a ride. The driver was our bishop. I was honored by his offer for a ride. I've known many religious leaders over the years who would never have slowed down, much less offered someone like me a ride. Bishop Carter did not make himself out as too important, too important for the likes of me or just some other attendee of the annual conference. I didn't take him up on the ride, but only because I really needed the exercise that morning. But like Jesus, he made himself available, accessible, not too far removed, close to someone like me, to any like us. Rather than being a bother to Jesus, encountering these women was an opportunity for Jesus to demonstrate love, acceptance, compassion, care, mercy. You've likely heard some version of one's character is most evident by how one treats those who are not in a position to either retaliate or reciprocate. God's character does not depend on what we might do to or for God. After all, what can we really do to or for God that God needs? We've already been loved before we had a chance to do anything. As Paul would remind us, Christ died on our behalf while we were yet enemies. You are loved. We are loved. You are no bother to Jesus. Perhaps we still need to hear Jesus' words again. Your faith has made you whole. Go in peace. Be healed of your disease.